Everyone remembers the P-51 Mustang as the fighter that won the air war over Europe. Clean lines, bubble canopy, the silhouette every documentary freezes on. So here's the problem. When the RAF's own wartime evaluators, professionals whose only job was telling pilots what would keep them alive and what would get them killed, stacked the late Spitfire against that American legend, the Mark XIV came out ahead in nearly every pure air combat parameter that mattered. If the Spitfire was the better dogfighter on paper, why did America still put 15,586 Mustangs into the sky? And why did that production run matter more to winning the war than the better fighter? The answer requires dismantling two myths at the same time. The first is that the Mustang was America's invention, born of American need, an expression of American manufacturing genius. The second is that the Spitfire was simply outclassed. Neither is true. What actually happened is more interesting. A British purchasing order, a British engine, a mathematician's supercharger, and two aircraft serving two entirely different wars within the same war. One was the sharper sword. The other was the weapon you could build in thousands and fly to Berlin and back. And the only reason the second one existed at all was the first. Start with the evaluation. In early 1944, the RAF's Air Fighting Development Unit, the AFDU, the body tasked with comparative fighter trials and tactical development, ran a direct head-to-head assessment of the Spitfire Mk XIV and the Mustang III, which was the RAF designation for the Merlin-powered P-51 B and C. The AFDU wasn't writing advertising copy. It was deciding what pilots should fly and why and in what circumstances. Its conclusions were precise and, for those who only know the Mustang legend, surprising. In maximum speed, the two aircraft were described as practically identical. The Spitfire had a marginal edge, roughly 9 miles per hour, which the evaluators deemed operationally negligible. Official performance testing of Mark XIV airframe JF319 at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment had recorded 446 miles per hour at approximately 25,900 feet in full supercharger gear. Some later accounts put figures close to 448 miles per hour under different boost conditions. But 446 is the number the performance test supports and the one this script will use. The point is that the gap between the two aircraft in flat-out speed was real but small, not decisive. Where the Spitfire separated itself was in climb. The AFDU's language was unambiguous. The Mark XIV was very much better in maximum climb than the Mustang III. Separate AFDU trials recorded that the Mustang had a considerably lower rate of climb at full power at all heights. Not slightly lower, considerably. In turning circle and rate of roll, the advantage also tended toward the Spitfire, particularly at low to moderate speeds. In a pure close-quarters dogfight, the kind of fight where a pilot needs to convert a positional disadvantage into a firing solution inside 30 seconds, the Mark XIV held most of the cards. The Mustang's clear advantage was in diving. It pulled away from the Spitfire in a sustained high-speed descent, partly because its laminar flow wing gave it a compressibility edge over contemporary designs, including the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning. In a dive, the Mustang could go where the Spitfire couldn't follow without running into serious handling problems. That detail matters. It was a meaningful tactical escape route, but it didn't reverse the overall combat verdict. And then the AFDU said something that blew the whole comparison open. Without a long-range tank, the AFDU wrote, the Spitfire Mk XIV has no endurance. Even fitted with a 90-gallon slipper tank, it had roughly half the range of a Mustang III, carrying two 62.5-gallon drop tanks. Half. The aircraft that climbed better, turned tighter, and could outfight the Mustang in close combat couldn't follow the mission that most needed to be flown. That gap is where the strategic argument lives. But to understand how both aircraft arrived at that gap, you have to go back further, to the engine that made the Spitfire extraordinary, and to the separate engineering chain that made the Mustang transformative. The Spitfire Mk I that flew over southern England in the summer of 1940 was powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin III, a 27-litre liquid-cooled V12 making approximately 1,030 horsepower. It was a superb engine for its time. The aircraft it pulled through the sky was fast, agile, and beautifully balanced. Pilots described flying it as like wearing the machine rather than operating it. But the airframe and the engine were also closely matched. The Merlin gave the Spitfire what it needed, and the Spitfire gave the Merlin a platform to express itself in. Neither had much margin left over. By 1944, the Mk XIV was flying with a Rolls-Royce Griffon 65. The numbers changed the frame entirely. The Griffon displaced approximately 36.7 litres, a 36% increase over the Merlin, and produced between 2,035 and 2,050 horsepower, depending on the variant and boost setting. Nearly double the power of the Mk I, packed into an engine that was, despite everything, physically not much larger than what it replaced. The Griffon stood 46 inches high and 30 inches wide, virtually the same frontal dimensions as the Merlin. Rolls-Royce had found ways to extract extraordinary output from roughly the same space. The Mk XIV had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, a 5-blade Rotol propeller, and a longer, heavier, more prominent nose that changed the aircraft's whole character. Because the Griffon changed the character in ways that weren't entirely comfortable. The Merlin turned its propeller clockwise when viewed from the front. The Griffon turned the opposite way, counterclockwise. That reversal created a swing to the right on takeoff rather than to the left, which was the opposite of everything Merlin-trained pilots had learned to counter through muscle memory. On an aircraft producing more than 2,000 horsepower and sitting on a narrow gear, that kind of surprise wasn't abstract. The throttle had to be opened slowly and carefully on takeoff. Swing the nose too fast, and you were already off the runway before you'd registered what was happening. Landing was its own problem. The Griffon's longer nose sat higher in the approach, putting the cockpit further back relative to the nose. The pilot's sightlines forward in a three-point attitude were obscured by the cowling in a way Merlin Spitfire pilots hadn't encountered. The tail-down attitude required for a conventional landing created a genuine blind spot ahead. Only experienced pilots were cleared onto Griffon Spitfires, and the conversion required formal retraining to undo years of ingrained Merlin handling instincts. That experience premium had operational consequences. The Mk XIV wasn't a machine you handed to a freshly minted pilot and turned loose. Its combat edge came with a training cost, a handling complexity, and an attrition risk that the simpler, steadier Mustang didn't impose to nearly the same degree. The Griffon Spitfire's most visible wartime deployment tells part of that story. Mk XIV units were at the forefront of V-1 flying bomb interception in 1944, where the aircraft's speed advantage at low altitude, boosted by 150-octane fuel to around 400 miles per hour at 2,000 feet, made it the most successful variant at destroying the bombs. The Mk XIV accounted for 300 V-1 kills. That was the right aircraft for that fight. Short range, high speed, technically demanding, flown by seasoned pilots. A local air combat weapon doing exactly what it was designed to do. Now reset the Mustang's story completely. In early 1940, the British Purchasing Commission, a body established in the United States in late 1939 specifically to source American aircraft for the RAF, approached North American aviation with a familiar request. They wanted fighters, and they were initially interested in North American building Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks under license. North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, proposed something different. Give us the time it would take to set up a P-40 line, and we'll give you a better aircraft, designed from scratch. The British agreed. The formal project commenced on 4 May 1940, with a firm contract for 320 aircraft signed on 29 May. The prototype, designated NA-73X, rolled out of the Inglewood, California factory on 9 September 1940, approximately 102 days after the contract was signed, and flew for the first time on 26 October 1940. The name Mustang was assigned by a BPC contract amendment on 9 December. The British had ordered it, funded it, named it, and taken the first deliveries. The early production Mustang Mk I entered RAF service in Army Cooperation and Tactical Reconnaissance Squadrons in approximately April and May 1942, flying with units including No. 26, 239, 241 and 268 squadrons, and the RCAF's No. 400 Squadron. The aircraft was fast and agile below 15,000 feet and well suited to low-level work. Above 15,000 to 18,000 feet, the Allison V1710 engine ran out of effective supercharging. The single-stage, single-speed supercharger couldn't maintain the manifold pressure the engine needed at the altitudes where most of the serious air combat in Europe was now occurring. By 1942, the main action was happening at 22,000 to 27,000 feet, precisely the band where the Allison Mustang was at its weakest. The USAAF, for its part, didn't rush to champion the aircraft. Procurement priorities in 1941 and 1942 favoured the P-38 and P-47 for high-altitude work, and initial American use of Mustang airframes concentrated on ground attack, the A-36 Apache, and reconnaissance variants. The aircraft that would define the air war over Germany was, at this point in the story, consigned to hedge-hopping over occupied France. What changed the Mustang's fate happened on 30th April 1942 at the RAF Air Fighting Development Unit base at Duxford, the same AFDU that would later evaluate the Mark XIV, and it took about 30 minutes. Ronald Ward Harker was a senior liaison test pilot for Rolls-Royce, invited to fly a Mustang Mark I by Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord, the AFDU's commanding officer, who had the aircraft on strength for high-altitude trials. Harker spent 30 minutes in the cockpit, came away impressed by the airframe and exasperated by the engine, and the following morning, May 1942, returned to the Rolls-Royce facility at Hucknall and wrote an internal memo that would shape the rest of the war. The Mustang with a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, Harker wrote, ought to prove much faster than contemporary adversaries and the Spitfire V fighters. The aircraft's aerodynamics were good enough. It was the power plant that was limiting everything. Later accounts would describe Harker as the man who put the Merlin in the Mustang. The engine that Harker recommended had its own story, and it runs through a mathematician named Stanley Hooker. Hooker joined Rolls-Royce in January 1938 after an interview with Ernest Hives, whose quip about Hooker's mathematical rather than conventional engineering background produced the title of Hooker's 1984 autobiography, Not Much of an Engineer. He wasn't a mechanic, he was a theoretician with a talent for fluid dynamics, and he arrived at Rolls-Royce and systematically analysed the inefficiencies in the existing Merlin supercharger. He raised its efficiency from 68 to 76% by redesigning the intake, impeller and diffuser system. Work that fed directly into the Merlin 20 and 45 series, boosting power by roughly 30% over earlier versions and powering the Spitfire Mk XIV, the most numerous Spitfire variant of the war. The two-stage supercharger was a different problem altogether. A single centrifugal impeller can compress intake air to maintain near sea-level manifold pressure up to a critical altitude, above which the compressor can't keep up with the thinning air. Hooker's solution was two impellers in series. The first compresses the incoming air. Between the first and second stages sits an intercooler, cooling the compressed charge before the second impeller compresses it further. The result is a doubly compressed, denser air charge that the engine can sustain to much higher altitudes. Two gear ratios, two speeds, allow optimization for different height bands. The Royal Society's biographical memoir of Hooker, published in 1986, acknowledged his role in development of the two-stage supercharger with intercooler for the next major step in Merlin development. Hooker later recalled in interviews that he had personally proposed and calculated the design, and that it worked essentially on the first attempt. The Merlin 61 that resulted from this work produced approximately 1,390 horsepower at 23,500 feet, the kind of performance at altitude that the Allison V1710, with its single stage, simply couldn't approach. It entered service in the Spitfire Mk XIV from July 1942. Harker had flown the Mustang less than 3 months earlier and immediately recognized what putting this engine behind that airframe would mean. Rolls-Royce received 6 Mustang Mark Is for conversion. The aircraft received the designation Mustang X. The first of these, airframe AL975, fitted with a 4-bladed Rotol propeller, flew from Hucknall on the 13th October 1942 with Rolls-Royce chief test pilot R.T. Shepherd at the controls. Reportedly, test results showed a new top speed of 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet and an absolute ceiling of over 40,000 feet. By the time the small test fleet was delivering these figures, production arrangements were already moving. Reportedly, the USAAF's interest had been secured in part by Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, who arranged for 2 Mustang X aircraft to be sent to American commanders in England for evaluation, ensuring the most operationally relevant audience saw the results firsthand. What went into production wasn't the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 itself, but a license-built American version, the Packard V1650, manufactured by the Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit under a license arrangement that began in August 1941. Packard eventually produced approximately 55,500 of these engines, the V1650-3 based on the Merlin 63 for P-51B and C variants, the V1650-7 for the P-51D. The chain ran. Hooker designs the supercharger concept at Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce develops the Merlin 60 series, Packard licenses and mass-produces American variants, and North American Aviation drops the resulting engine into the airframe the British had originally commissioned. The Mustang that would escort bombers to Berlin was, at its engineering core, an Allied creation assembled from 2 continents. Performance figures from test data for the P-51B are unambiguous on what the conversion achieved. Maximum speed of approximately 440 miles per hour at 24,500 feet under war emergency power settings, a figure that compares directly with the Spitfire Mk XIV's 446 miles per hour at 25,900 feet, which is precisely what makes the AFDU's practically identical speed verdict coherent. Critical altitude, the height at which performance began to fall, shifted from the Allison's 15,000 to 18,000 feet to the Packard Merlin's 24,000 to 26,000 feet. The Mustang had crossed into the altitude band where the air war was actually being fought. Two additional elements of the Allied engineering chain deserve mention before the strategic argument takes over. The first, RAF Mustang 1s and early P-51Bs, used the standard-framed razorback canopy that gave pilots poor rearward visibility, a serious tactical liability. A British-designed improvement, the Malcolm hood, replaced the flat centre section of the canopy with a blown, frameless perspex panel that significantly improved the view aft. It was retrofitted in the field to P-51Bs and Cs, and the underlying concept, a frameless, curved canopy prioritising all-around visibility, fed directly into the full bubble canopy introduced on the P-51D. The teardrop canopy that defines the aircraft's iconic silhouette today had British engineering thinking embedded in its lineage. The second element was fuel. The range figures that make the Mustang's Berlin mission possible required external fuel, and the drop tanks that first extended P-51 range in the European theatre were British-manufactured paper and composition tanks, layered and laminated. They couldn't hold fuel for extended periods, but they held it long enough. British-produced drop tanks, a British-designed supercharger, a British-originated purchasing order, a British-named aircraft, and the Americans built it in quantities that Britain never could have matched. The strategic necessity that made those quantities non-negotiable arrived in two acts, both named Schweinfurt. On the 17th of August 1943, the 8th Air Force dispatched 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses in a double strike against the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt aircraft factories at Regensburg. Both missions were deep penetrations into Germany, beyond the effective escort range of available fighters. The losses across both forces totaled 60 B-17s, 36 from the Schweinfurt force, 24 from the Regensburg shuttle. Each B-17 carried a 10-man crew. Unsustainable isn't a rhetorical word. It was the operational conclusion. The follow-up strike against Schweinfurt was delayed until 14th of October 1943. That day, Black Thursday, 291 B-17s were dispatched. 60 were shot down. 17 more were so badly damaged they were written off. A further 121 returned with varying degrees of battle damage. German flak and approximately 300 Luftwaffe fighters killed or captured around 600 American airmen in a single afternoon. The loss rate for the striking force approached 26%. Air University described it as the largest single-day loss of the campaign to that point. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary American fighter in the theatre during this period, had a combat radius of approximately 375 miles, even with drop tanks, enough to escort bombers to the German border and partway beyond, but nowhere near Schweinfurt or Berlin. The P-38 Lightning offered somewhat greater reach, but suffered severe reliability problems in the cold at European combat altitudes. Engine failures, cockpit heating failures, and handling difficulties that made it an imperfect interim escort at best. The gap between where escort fighters could go and where the bombers needed to go was measured in hundreds of miles and in the lives of 10-man crews. After October 1943, 8th Bomber Command effectively curtailed deep, unescorted penetrations into central Germany, focusing on targets within fighter range while the Merlin Mustang arrived in operational numbers. The first P-51B units reached Europe by late 1943. On the 6th of March 1944, Mustangs escorted American bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of approximately 1,100 miles. It was the first time single-engine fighters based in Britain had reached the German capital. The escort that had been strategically impossible in August and October of 1943 was now, by March of 1944, a regular operational reality. The Spitfire Mk XIV, for all its combat superiority in the dogfight the AFDU measured, couldn't have performed that mission. The AFDU itself said so. Without a long-range tank, it had no meaningful endurance. With its best available tank, it had roughly half the range of a Mustang III. The aircraft that turned tighter and climbed faster and outrolled the Mustang in a close-quarters engagement wasn't the aircraft that could solve the problem the 8th Air Force was facing. These weren't the same problem. The doctrinal background to that separation matters, because it explains why Britain developed the Mk XIV it needed rather than the escort fighter it didn't. The Butt Report, released in August 1941, had laid out the brutal statistical truth about RAF night bombing. Only about 1/3 of aircraft claiming to reach their targets actually got within 5 miles of them. Over the Ruhr, in poor conditions, the proportion was closer to 1 in 10. Churchill described the report as a very serious paper. The formal response was the Area Bombing Directive of February 1942, which shifted Bomber Command decisively toward night area attacks rather than daylight precision strikes. Night bombing eliminated the operational requirement for long-range daylight escorts. The Spitfire's short range wasn't a failure of British engineering. It was a correct match to what British doctrine actually required. The US AAF reached different conclusions from different assumptions. Committed to daylight precision bombing using the Norden bombsight, a doctrine premised on the belief that accurate attacks on specific industrial targets could shorten the war, the Americans needed their bombers to operate in daylight over defended territory, which meant they needed fighters that could accompany them. That doctrinal commitment made long-range escort not a nice-to-have, but an operational necessity. The divergence in bombing doctrine is why the RAF could accept a short-range interceptor as its premier fighter, and the US AAF couldn't. What an escort pilot experienced in that Merlin Mustang is worth understanding on its own terms, separate from the combat performance comparison. Bud Anderson, a P-51 pilot who flew with the 357th Fighter Group, recorded that his average combat mission ran approximately 4.5 hours. His longest, on D-Day, was 6 hours and 55 minutes. Berlin missions were among the longest routinely flown. The 1,100-mile round trip at cruise speeds implied roughly 7 to 8 hours in the cockpit for the escort pilot. 7 hours in a seat the width of your shoulders, oxygen mask strapped across your face from climb through descent, cockpit temperatures at 25,000 feet, cold enough to numb hands inside gloves. The confined space, the sustained oxygen dependency, the discipline required not to follow an engaging target beyond fuel constraints. These were miseries the Griffon Spitfire pilot, flying a 1 to 2 hour interception sortie from a home airfield, didn't share. Both jobs were genuinely dangerous. They were dangerous in entirely different ways. The Griffon Spitfire pilot faced the compressed violence of a close-quarters engagement, an aircraft that would punish inattention on takeoff and landing, and a combat envelope that rewarded absolute precision. The Mustang escort pilot faced duration, cold, hypoxic concentration, and the specific psychological weight of watching bombers ahead of him burning while he managed his fuel state and decided whether he could afford the pursuit. Admiration without romance is the right frame for both. Now the numbers that make the strategic argument irreversible. Between 1941 and 1945, North American aviation produced 15,586 P-51 Mustangs of all variants. From the early Allison-powered A variants and the A-36 ground attack version, through the P-51B and C Merlin conversions, to the definitive P-51D bubble canopy model, of which nearly 8,000 were built, and the late-war P-51H. Production ran at two plants, the primary facility in Inglewood, California, and a second line in Dallas, Texas, established when Inglewood reached capacity. At peak output, the Inglewood facility alone was producing approximately 250 aircraft per month. Rows of completed Mustangs sat at the Inglewood factory, waiting for delivery pilots to finish training and take them away. Against that, total production of the Spitfire Mk XIV, 957 aircraft. One production run, constrained by Griffon engine availability, by British manufacturing capacity that had been managing Luftwaffe bombing campaigns since 1940, and by the fundamental reality that Rolls-Royce's production was stretched across multiple critical programs simultaneously. The Mk XIV was a superb aircraft, built in numbers that reflected its interceptor role and the industrial limits within which it operated. The Mustang was built in numbers that reflected American manufacturing scale, an undamaged home industrial base, and the strategic appetite of a nation fighting a global air war from two ocean-separated theatres. 15,586 against 957. That ratio, roughly 16-1, isn't an argument about quality. It's an argument about what kind of weapon wins a sustained industrial war. The full picture of the Allied engineering chain should sit inside those numbers. The Mustang began as a British purchasing order. Its airframe was designed in response to British specifications. The engine that made it strategically relevant was designed by a British mathematician at a British company. Packard's license-built V1650s, approximately 55,500 of them, were American-produced versions of a British-originated design. The Malcolm hood that improved cockpit visibility came from British designers. The paper and composition drop tanks that gave the aircraft range to reach Berlin were British manufactured. The aircraft that defined American air power in the European theatre was, at virtually every critical engineering juncture, a product of collaboration that neither country could have achieved alone. The Spitfire Mk XIV sits in that picture not as the loser of the comparison, but as the aircraft that proves the comparison was always the wrong question. The AFDU evaluation showed the Mk XIV winning the dogfight. It did. The evidence for that is as solid as wartime evaluation language gets. Not a courtroom verdict, but the considered judgment of professionals whose assessments determined operational doctrine. The Spitfire was better in maximum climb, better in turning circle, marginally faster, and tended toward the advantage in roll rate. In a pure close-quarters engagement at the kind of altitude where the Griffin's two-stage supercharger was operating at its best, the Mk XIV was the more dangerous machine to be on the other side of. But the AFDU also recorded, with equal precision, that the Mk XIV had no endurance. That finding didn't diminish the aircraft. It defined its role. The Mk XIV was designed for the fight Britain was actually fighting. Fast, lethal, short-range interceptions of intruders crossing the coast, V1 engagements over southern England, tactical air superiority over the bridgehead in Normandy. It was the right answer to the British strategic problem. The Mustang was the right answer to the American one. Different problems, different answers, one Allied air war. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the US 8th Air Force were equipped with Mustangs. By that same point, the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies over Germany had been systematically broken. Not in a single decisive dogfight, but over months of escort operations that drew German fighters into engagements they couldn't sustain at a production rate they couldn't match. The Mustang didn't win those engagements because it was a purer dogfighter than the aircraft opposing it. It won them because there were enough Mustangs to be there every day, and because they could go where the bombing campaign needed them to go. The Mark XIV could win the dogfight the RAF measured. The Mustang could win the war the Allies had to fight. That distinction isn't the full story either. The Griffon Spitfire kept operational pressure across Channel and over the bridgeheads in France. The Mark XIV did kill V1s that would have reached London. The two aircraft were doing different work in the same theatre, not competing for the same job, and the war required both. What the P-51 became, the aircraft that ended the Luftwaffe as an effective strategic force that escorted American bombers to Berlin on 6th of March 1944, that destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in the European theatre. It became because of a British purchasing commission that went looking for a fighter in early 1940. A British test pilot who spent 30 minutes in a borrowed cockpit on 30th of April 1942. A British mathematician who redesigned a supercharger from first principles, and American factories that could translate those inputs into an industrial fact. The P-51 only became that weapon after a British order and a British engine. Together, not in a fantasy one-on-one, they closed the sky. Subscribe for more stories like this.